Hi, this is Greg Kilstrom. Welcome to Season 3 of the Agile World, where we discuss customer and employee experience, organizational and workforce transformation, and how business can adapt and continually improve in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed in this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles, or get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. Today we're going to talk about the sometimes unseen power of invention. Often, inventors and creators of new ideas and products have a vision in mind, but don't always see the full value of what they've created until sometime later, or with the help of some outside perspective. My guest today has quite a list of accomplishments. He's the inventor of noise-canceling headphones during his time at Bose. He worked with Apple to create the Apple new product process, which is still used in their product divisions, and has worked with many household names such as Amazon, Cisco, IBM, HP, Fitbit, and more. He has also written a book called Innovate Products Faster, Graphical Tools for Accelerating Product Development. I'd like to welcome John Carter, principal at TCGen. First, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do in your role, and welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for asking, Greg, and I'm glad to be here. What I do is mainly work with companies that are trying to improve either innovation or velocity in their product development activities, typically working with larger teams, although I work with startups all the way to large global brands that you've mentioned. And the thing about it that I love is I love working with engineers. I have that technical background. And at the same time, I understand business. And so I try and, if you will, help companies bridge the gap between, if you will, the technology and the market and help them succeed.
That's great. Well, yeah, looking forward to having a conversation here. So let's start with the topic of invention and understanding the value of an idea. Can you talk a little bit about your time at Bose and why did you start working on the noise canceling headphones?
Well, it's kind of a story with twists and turns. I actually went to MIT because Dr. Bose was a professor there, and I wanted to study with him. And during that time, I got to work with him as my thesis advisor and helped him with his courses. After leaving MIT, I immediately joined the Bose corporation and began as a research engineer. And we started on two projects, Greg, if you can believe it. I was focused on essentially a program to make speakers sound better and a program to make headphones sound better. And I think we're going to come back to this further on in our discussions. But one of the things I learned early on is focus. And I was making much more progress in the headphone sound experimental activities than I was in the speaker area. And so I had a conversation with Dr. Bose, and we totally dropped the speaker research and focused 100% on the headphones. And that lesson of focus and picking something and really, if you will, bearing down on it, obviously paid us back in terms of a fruitful product. So making choices and sticking with them was the idea. And actually it started with truly a napkin sketch.
Wow. Wow, an actual napkin. That's great.
Yeah, well, that's a little exaggeration. Dr. Bose used to, he's deceased now, but when I worked with him, he would get a ream of copier paper, 8.5 by 11 white paper.
Nice.
And
Nice.
he would do all of his work on sheets and sheets and sheets of papers with complex formula and derivations on it. And it was just on one of those scribbled pieces of paper that the idea emerged that we started working on together.
Wow, that's great. Well, yeah, talk a little bit more about the innovation process for creating the noise canceling headphones. When we talked earlier, you mentioned that you knew you were onto something, but it not necessarily what what the value proposition didn't end up necessarily being what you originally thought it was. So what's talk a little bit about that process and what did you learn from it?
Well, a couple things, and these might be useful to your listeners. Is even though Bose at the time was medium sized, they're now fairly large. They dedicated 10% of their product activities to innovation. So I don't know, let's say they spent $10 million a year, they would actually devote 1 million out of that or more to work on innovations just like this. And so one of the things that Dr. Bose really established was kind of a investment in innovation. And it was very broad, very broad. I was one of maybe 8 people or 10 people working on different research projects. And what happened is, I mentioned we had this idea, which was sketched out in primitive form, and I tried it in 2 weeks. I got it working, very, very primitive. And I put it on my head, and I thought, wow, this really can make headphones sound better. And so I demonstrated to Dr. Bose. I timidly put the contraption on his head and turned it on, hoping it wouldn't squeal or react in a bad way. And he smiled. And we thought we're really onto something. But what we discovered, Greg, is that we actually didn't know what we were onto. We thought we were inventing a product or a concept that would make headphones sound better, more bass and easier to fit and so forth, lower distortion, all these sound attributes. But when we talked to customers, we realized that wasn't the real important part of the innovation. It actually was noise reduction. And we knew of that, but we didn't focus on it. And we spent a lot of time before we showed it to early prototypes to customers, optimizing sound, only to realize that the real value was in its ability to reduce noise. Seems obvious at this time, it wasn't then.
Yeah.
And the striking thing for me is Dr. Bose and I knew more about this technology than anyone in the world at the time.
Wow.
And we did not guess the right ultimate use and benefit of the product. We were the inventors, and Dr. Bose has a great market sense. But we got feedback and we listened.
Yeah, that's fascinating because yeah, we just take for granted that isn't I mean it's they're a great invention, but you assume that it was intentional from the very beginning, and that's amazing.
So, and on this point, Greg, I learned many times that actually the inventors come up with a solution, and it has primary benefits A, B, and C, and secondary benefits D, E, and F. Oftentimes, when you share it with customers, it turns out it's innovation F. It's
Yeah.
not the primary, but in fact, it's the secondary. So this is one thing that's kind of surprising about innovation is you really never know until you show it to customers.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. Well, yeah, switching gears a little bit, I'm a big fan and big user of Apple and their products. I'm looking at my uh, Apple laptop, have my iPhone next to me, so on and so forth. Their record of success obviously has been consistent from just about every aspect you can measure. When you're, in working with Apple, why was it important for them to create the standardized process that you worked with them on, and how did creating that Apple new product process help the company achieve more success?
Well, it's a great question, and obviously they're really the benchmark in terms of product innovation, or one of many, but certainly in the consumer spaces is very much recognized for that. The challenge at Apple was that basically they were scaling. So they were growing quickly. And they had branched out in product activities. I started in the computer division, and they were working on their laptop line and their desktop line. And they actually were trying to do, instead of let's say one laptop and one desktop, they're trying to do three at the same time of each. So they went from essentially two product activities to six or something like that scale. They really were growing. And the challenge is the teams were repeating mistakes. It's okay to make a mistake one time. It's not okay to make it a second time. And one of the great things about Agile is retrospectives. So if you look at an activity, a sprint or a release plan, and then you look at what went well and what went wrong, you obviously identify areas for improvement. Well, what we did is we looked across their product activities and kind of aggregated the opportunities for improvement. And we thought that having a very lightweight, standardized process, kind of a hybrid between agile and waterfall, was the best way to go to prevent repeating mistakes and allowing them to scale. And it's really funny, kind of like the headphone story, where we started with the belief that it was headphone performance and sound, and then came to realize that it was actually noise reduction. In the case of Apple and working with them, I started focusing on metrics, kind of measuring
Yeah.
things like backlogs and so forth. And it turned out, well, that wasn't their root cause. That would only highlight it. But actually, we looked more fundamentally at what they're trying to achieve. And what we actually did together was create this lightweight architecture or system, if you will, for scaling products. And we kept it very, very simple. And one of the things that this is going to astound you, but when you're trying to do things with multiple teams, it is insanely important that you call similar things by the same name.
Mm, yeah.
And when different teams, this is true in estimating and when doing relative sizing on agile teams or estimation or any other kind of deliveries, whether they be demos. Well, if you have one team using one mental model for a demo and another using another, you can't compare these two teams and put them on a level playing field. And so what we focused on, this will kind of is shocking, and we got pushback until it really proved itself, is we actually measured the use of certain terms.
Hmm.
And believe
Interesting.
it or not, as summarized in kind of aggregate status updates across 50 or 60 programs. They were fairly large at the time. What we found out is that we saw people were using the right names for their sprints and release planning milestones, but in fact, they they at some point the metric, the usage actually started dropping after we did all the training. And we did a root cause analysis of why aren't teams using the same words for things in the same way. It's crazy. You would think that'd be so trivial. Well, the problem was we didn't train the right people. We trained the engineers and product people, but we didn't train those people that actually coordinated release plans. They
Huh.
were in a way
Yeah.
a little lower level and off to the side. They weren't lower level, but we didn't include them in the original training. Well, we did a rapid turnaround, agilely adjusted our transformation attempts and efforts, and got those people trained, and the metric took off. And just as soon as people were calling the same things by the same name to mean the same things to everybody across the programs, we went on to our next goal. But it's so important in organizations that are trying to grow and scale to call things the same way, so everybody has a common definition. People often argue about the words, the names themselves, but that it's
Right.
really what they mean.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's interesting, and I mean, I would imagine at a any at a large organization that, yeah, the waste and simply confusion is probably bad enough, let alone the other costs there. Um, one, speaking of Apple, Steve Jobs was famous for his views on not wanting to rely too much on focus groups while creating new products. I know you've talked a bit about how customers can really contribute towards understanding the value and some of the innovative aspects of and where to focus. How do those two things kind of because there's a bit of there's a bit of a paradox there, I guess you could say, but how do you kind of reconcile those two things?
The difference is the difference between capital I innovation and small case I innovation. And
Gotcha.
that is that when Steve Jobs is talking, or when he talked about not using focus groups or relying on them, he was really talking about the breakthrough ideas. For example, the iPod player or the iPhone or the iPad, their tablets, or many of the other things they've implemented with iTunes moving to Apple Music, etc. These are innovations with a capital I that your customers actually couldn't tell you about because they don't exist or they wouldn't have ever imagined them to be in the real world. And so it's this unbridled imagination. That was true of Dr. Bose as well. So it combined their incredible product instincts along with their market sensing ability to solve problems that people didn't know existed. And you can't use a focus group to help you there. On the other hand, and this is where I think it actually is a misperception, is that Apple and other great brands use focus groups or similar research methods to help with the small I innovations or what we might call improvements. In other words, looking at various options, let's say configuration in terms of looking at your iPhone, like how much storage should you have on it, or how fast should it be, or how many cameras, etc. And so those are choices when you've got an existing product in an existing marketplace. People don't need their imagination to give the organization feedback. And so it's kind of a blunt overstatement to say that they don't use or rely too much on focus groups. It's really looking at where they use insights from their customers, and it's in the kind of the choices that they make in terms of configurations or details around the product, but not the innovation.
That's great. Yeah, that's great to have that clarification from, and obviously someone who's worked with those with those teams at Apple, and yeah, that's a good perspective to have, because it's certainly you want to get that feedback, um, but yeah, no, that's a great, and I think that is one of those, that maybe that's the downside of googling for quotes and ideas and stuff, is things tend to be either summarized broadly or potentially misconstrued and stuff, so that's a good clarification there.
Yeah, and a really good thing for your listeners to know about is something called conjoint analysis. And we didn't explore that specifically at Apple, but I have with many other companies. And conjoint analysis will actually tell you how much a consumer will pay for, let's say, added storage. Is it worth $100? Is it worth $200? And how would they trade off better storage for better cameras, say? So there's some really great techniques that are out there that can give you insights in terms of configurations or smaller changes besides focus groups. I just thought your listeners might
Yeah,
might want to know about that one.
that's great. Well, yeah, let's talk about another one of the companies you've worked with, Mozilla, where you've worked with them to create an internal innovation center. Why is it important to create something like this? I mean, obviously, Mozilla, lots of tech startups, they're thought of as innovative from the start. How does stressing innovation in such a direct way improve the company's direction?
Well, I think there are three important elements of this. The first is it helps frame an investment. In other words, we believe in innovation. Of course, innovation comes from all areas, but we're talking about creating innovations that really might be transformational. So it frames how much do you want to invest in transformational innovation, i.e., let's say a new technology to existing customers, or
Yeah.
new customers existing, or new, both new markets, new customers, and new technologies. And so it frames an investment. The second thing it does is it provides a protected space. And by this, I mean essentially an organization which we created, which was virtual. We basically looked at messaging through Slack and other channels, and gave them a reprieve on the normal corporate flow of conversation so that they could focus. And also, we gave them freedom in terms of rigid schedules. They didn't have to follow that. So we created a protected space, both virtually and with fewer rules. And the third thing we could do, and would be useful for any of your listeners, is it kind of ensures that your inventive ideas are aligned with your mission. Oftentimes your employees come up with really great ideas, but you can't use them. And so this third element really helps ensure that you align these bigger bets, the riskier bets, with the mission and strategy of the company.
Yeah. Yeah. What would your for those that don't necessarily have the budgets of Mozilla, Apple, any of the other companies of that kind, how would you recommend that they do something similar? How do they foster innovation within and to build better products?
Yeah, well, this is, I think, a very reasonable question. For example, how does a small organization of, let's say, 5 or 6 people deal with this kind of situation? And obviously, you can't have a big research team or research budget, but nevertheless, innovation is very important to you. I think that the most important thing is that you have to really understand that innovation requires focus. And if you really want to be successful, you have to be able to have at least one person have this as their number one priority. It doesn't mean that they can't work on other things at the same time, but it does mean that either they've got space in projects that would give them some time available, or can, let's say, push back some discretionary ideas. But it's really important to have focus. And at small companies, it's hard because you only have a handful of people. But what you can do is, if you've got an idea that aligns with your business, that could be transformative, that would move the needle in terms of revenue or profit margin, then it's a tough decision, because it means that you're not going to do something, is actually to focus your resources on one thing. Don't do many things. And I'm not talking about small I innovation. I think that's great. Everybody should have ideas and suggestions, and people should incrementally improve all the time. But if smaller organizations really want to make a difference in terms of something transformative, simply verify that it's aligned with your strategy. You can use it. Secondarily, will it move the needle? Is it worth carving out a little resource for it? And third, make it someone's job number one. They're number one, but not only priority. And that's how I think smaller companies can actually use some of these lessons.
That's great. Well, one last question before we wrap up. Where do you look for inspiration in creating new ideas, processes, ways to enable organizations to achieve greater success?
That's a $64,000 question. One thing that I would recommend is a podcast strictly on innovation, called Killer Innovations, where Phil McKinney, the former CTO of HP, interviews a lot of different executives in different situations, specifically on the innovation podcast. So, in addition to your own, I'd recommend that. And secondarily, what I would also do, and this is more internal, but I think it applies equally everywhere, is to really view innovations as very fragile. And so when people have ideas that come up to you and think that they might want to endeavor to work on them, it's really important to give them space and time to do that. And it's, Jonathan Ives at Apple said this, inventions are very, very fragile, and you have to be very careful and nurture them. And so I think it's important that, organizations look out, and they can look at some great innovation resources out in the podcast world. And secondarily, to really treasure what they've got and nurture those fragile ideas.
Thanks. That's great. Well, John, thanks so much for joining the show. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
Well, I think you can come to our website, tcgen.com, and you can find out a lot of rich material. We've got a lot of content as well as useful tools and hints and templates that teams can use to improve innovation and move faster.
Wonderful. Well, again, I'd like to thank John Carter, principal at TCGen, for joining the show. Thanks for listening to the Agile World with Greg Kihlstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, from my website at theagile.world.